London, 1847. The city glittered beneath a veil of frost and gaslight, its grand avenues alive with the clatter of carriages and the quiet cruelty of whispered judgment. Inside the Whitmore townhouse, 1,000 candles burned against the winter gloom, their light reflected in chandeliers that trembled with every footstep of the nobility. The ballroom glowed golden, perfumed with roses and gossip, an altar to appearances where every glance was both invitation and blade. Tonight was the first ball of the season, and Lady Eleanor Whitmore stood at the heart of it, pale and poised, the reluctant bride-to-be of a man she had never come to know. Her gown, pale blue silk trimmed with ivory lace, shimmered as though spun from moonlight, yet there was no joy in her face. She smiled as etiquette required, curtsied where custom demanded, and endured the endless parade of congratulations offered by those who did not mean them. Behind her fan, the Dowager Duchess of Marlton murmured to a companion, her voice honeyed and poisonous. "Such a pretty girl, but poor thing, her Duke has not even attended. One wonders if the engagement is more leisure than love." The remark traveled swiftly, winding through the ballroom like smoke, until laughter followed it. Eleanor's spine straightened, her smile fixed like porcelain. Beneath her glove, her fingers trembled against her fan's ivory ribs. The Duke in question, Alaric Hawthorne, was not absent at all. From the shadowed corridor that overlooked the ballroom, he watched her with eyes that concealed too much. A tall man of measured bearing, his expression might have been mistaken for indifference, but within him lay a storm. He had come unannounced, unseen, to observe the woman chosen for him by family and circumstance. For weeks, whispers had reached him from every corner of society, that Lady Eleanor mocked his coldness, that she pitied the women who might marry such a man, that she accepted his proposal only to salvage her family's declining fortune. He had not wanted to believe it, yet curiosity, sharp and wounded, had driven him here tonight. Eleanor moved through the crowd like a ghost clothed in grace. When she laughed, it was soft but unsteady, the sound of someone performing a part she had not chosen. Alaric studied her carefully, noting the hesitation in her eyes each time another guest uttered his name. Was it contempt, or something closer to fear? His jaw tightened as he watched a young viscount lean too close while dancing with her, whispering something that drew a nervous smile to her lips. Alaric's gloved hand curled at his side, and he turned away before his thoughts betrayed him further. He had long mastered restraint, yet restraint, this night, felt like cowardice. Beyond the ballroom doors, he stepped into the cold night air, where frost clung to the carriages like silver lace. The moonlight poured over the cobblestones, and in that silence, he made a decision born of pride and a strange, aching need. He would know the truth of her heart, not through gossip, not through pretense, but through her unguarded words. If she despised him, he would hear it himself. If she was false, he would see it without illusion. And so the Duke conceived his test, a cruel experiment masked as humility. Within a week, he would enter the Whitmore household not as a suitor but as a servant. The following morning, London awoke to its usual symphony of bells and wheels, but within Hawthorne House, change was already stirring. Alaric dismissed half his retinue for the season and arranged a quiet departure, under the pretense of visiting his estates in Sussex. In truth, he slipped away under the name Mr. Hale, a recently discharged footman seeking work. His valet, bewildered but sworn to secrecy, helped him exchange the velvet of nobility for the coarse wool of service. When Alaric regarded his reflection, his hair unpowdered, his hands bare of rings, his bearing altered to humility, he found the sight disquieting. The mask of status had fallen, revealing the man beneath, uncertain and unsheltered by rank. A week later, Mr. Hale was employed at the Whitmore townhouse. The household, occupied by the Earl's numerous guests and servants, scarcely noticed another man in livery. He was quiet, efficient, and unremarkable, precisely as he intended. On his first morning, he carried a tray of tea and correspondence to the morning room, where Lady Eleanor sat by the window, the pale light outlining her profile in silver. She looked up briefly, her expression polite but tired. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice warmer than he expected. "You may leave it there." Her tone held no disdain, no arrogance, only weariness, as if even kindness demanded effort. When he bowed and turned to go, she added, almost absently, "Have you been long in service?" Alaric paused. "Long enough, my lady," he replied, his voice lower than usual, roughened to match his disguise. She nodded, distracted, and returned to her letter. That small exchange lingered with him through the day. He had expected vanity, perhaps scorn, something befitting the image painted by rumor. Yet she moved through the house with quiet composure, speaking gently to the maids, thanking the butler when he brought her shawl, reading in solitude by the fire as if she sought refuge in silence. That night, from the servants' corridor, Alaric glimpsed her standing alone by the grand staircase, gazing at the portrait of her late mother. There was grief in her eyes, real, unfeigned, and for the first time he felt an unease that had nothing to do with deception. The woman he spied upon was not the shallow heiress he had imagined, but someone caged by duty, just as he was. Days passed, and his observations deepened into fascination. He learned she painted when no one was near, that she kept a journal written in a small, elegant hand, and that she sometimes refused invitations merely to walk alone in the garden at dusk. One evening, he overheard her speaking to her maid, her voice quiet and trembling. "They say the Duke is a man of ice," she murmured. "Perhaps they are right. But I would rather be unloved than married to indifference." The words struck him like a blade turned inward. His heart, once guarded by discipline, began to crack beneath the weight of her honesty. The following night, he watched her again from the hall as she sat near the fire, a book unopened in her lap, her face caught between longing and resignation. He had come seeking truth, and he had found it, but not the truth he expected. Her loneliness mirrored his own, and it unsettled him more than any accusation could. When the clock struck midnight, he withdrew to his small servant's chamber, staring at his calloused hands as if they no longer belonged to him. For the first time in his life, the Duke of Hawthorne did not know who he was, nobleman or impostor, judge or penitent. Yet even as uncertainty consumed him, a strange tenderness took root in its place. Each morning he carried her letters, her tea, her books, hearing her soft, "Thank you," and wishing he could answer her not as Mr. Hale, but as himself. Still, he remained silent, bound by the very disguise that now imprisoned his heart. One evening, as rain began to fall against the tall windows, she spoke again to her maid. "Do you think it possible, Mary, for someone to see me beyond this title? To love me for myself?" The maid gave no answer. Alaric stood frozen in the corridor, listening to the rhythm of her words and the rain, knowing he had crossed a threshold from which he could not return. Winter began to thaw, and with it the rhythm of the Whitmore household softened. The first crocuses pierced the London frost, and sunlight slipped timidly through lace curtains as if reluctant to disturb the hush of waiting hearts. Within those walls, Alaric Hawthorne, still hidden behind the name of Mr. Hale, moved like a shadow among the servants, his presence unnoticed save for a few polite nods. Yet every day he found his gaze drawn to the same figure, Lady Eleanor, reading by the window or tending to her sketches, her expression distant but alive with quiet thought. She spoke little, but her silences were eloquent. To him, they spoke of restraint, of a woman too accustomed to being unheard. Each passing moment in her orbit made the deception weigh heavier on his soul. He had once believed himself immune to sentiment, a creature molded by duty and the cold etiquette of the court. Yet in her presence, the veneer cracked. When she smiled, rarely, fleetingly, it felt like sunlight slipping through cathedral glass. He began to memorize the sound of her voice, the soft rustle of her gown, the faint scent of rosewater that followed her into a room. He told himself it was only curiosity, the same impulse that had led him to masquerade as a servant. But the truth grew undeniable. Curiosity had turned to reverence, and reverence to love. It was a forbidden love, one he could neither confess nor flee, for his disguise had become the chain that bound him. One evening, while arranging the flowers in the drawing-room, he overheard her speaking to her maid again. The conversation was low, unguarded, shaped by the intimacy of dusk. "I have tried to imagine him," she said softly, eyes fixed upon the dying fire. "The Duke. They say he is proud, unreadable. Yet I wonder, what if he is merely lonely?" Her voice faltered, and she pressed a hand to her breast as though steadying herself. "I fear I shall marry a stranger who will never know me. But perhaps that is what marriage means for people like us." The words pierced Alaric with a guilt he could not express. Every kindness she offered him as a servant felt like a wound, for he knew she would despise him if she learned how he had invaded her trust. Yet he could not leave. The following morning, an impulse overtook him, reckless, tender, utterly unlike himself. He left a single pressed rose on her writing desk, wrapped in a folded scrap of parchment. Upon it, he wrote only 4 words. "You are not unseen." It was a foolish act, unworthy of the man he had been, but wholly in keeping with the man he was becoming. When he returned later to clear the room, he found her sitting there, the note held delicately between her fingers. Her eyes shimmered with a quiet astonishment. "Who would write such a thing?" she murmured, half to herself. Then she smiled faintly, tucking the rose into her book of sketches as though it were something sacred. The sight stole his breath. For the first time, she looked at peace. He told himself it was enough, that he had given her a small comfort in a world that rarely offered her kindness. He did not imagine what ruin such comfort might bring. 2 days later, a baroness came to call, an old friend of the Whitmore family and one of society's most merciless tongues. While the ladies took tea in the drawing-room, Alaric stood discreetly by the door, refilling cups as needed. The baroness's eyes, sharp and restless, wandered across the room until they landed on the open sketchbook upon the table. "What is this?" she asked, her tone light but poisoned. Eleanor reached forward too late. The baroness had already turned the pages. The pressed rose slipped free, falling like a drop of blood against the carpet. The baroness lifted the note with a gasp of theatrical delight. "Asterisk, you are not unseen. Asterisk, my dear, how romantic. And tell us, who is your mysterious admirer?" The words dripped with insinuation. The earl's brows furrowed in outrage. Eleanor flushed crimson, her lips parting in speechless horror. The baroness's laughter filled the room, echoed by whispers that would soon carry through every drawing-room in Mayfair. That night, the household trembled under the earl's fury. Alaric, watching from the shadows, heard the echo of his voice down the corridor, cold, sharp, relentless. "You will not bring disgrace upon this family, do you understand? To consort with a servant. If that rumor is true, the engagement is finished." Eleanor's voice broke through, trembling but defiant. "It is not true. I swear it." The slap of his hand against the table resounded like a gunshot. "Then you will stay confined to this house until the matter is forgotten." When silence finally fell, Alaric felt as though his own heart had been struck. His folly had ensnared her in shame. What had begun as curiosity had ended as cruelty, and there was no one to blame but himself. He spent that night pacing his small quarters, the walls closing in with every passing hour. For the first time in his life, Alaric Hawthorne felt powerless. He could end the rumor with a single confession, yet to reveal his true name now would only deepen her humiliation. What apology could erase the deceit that had led to her disgrace? Dawn came gray and reluctant, and still he had no answer. The mansion above him was silent, save for the faint sob he imagined echoing through the hall. In the days that followed, London's gossip swelled like a storm. The scandal was too delicious to ignore. Lady Eleanor Whitmore, fiancée to a duke, carrying on a secret romance with a common footman. The earl made hasty attempts to quell the talk, but the damage was done. Invitations ceased, acquaintances turned cold. Through it all, Eleanor moved like a figure carved from composure, her dignity intact but her eyes dimmed of light. Alaric watched helplessly, every breath steeped in guilt. Once, in the corridor, she passed him without noticing, her hands clasped tightly at her waist. He longed to speak, to tell her the truth, to beg her forgiveness, but the words stayed trapped behind the bars of pride and fear. One evening, as rain lashed against the windows, he found her standing in the courtyard beneath a black umbrella, staring up at the sky as though daring it to break her further. She seemed smaller than before, stripped of the quiet radiance she once carried. Her maid tried to draw her inside, but Eleanor shook her head. "I would rather face the rain than the eyes of those who pretend not to judge me," she whispered. Then, after a pause that cut the air like glass, she added, "Perhaps I deserve it. I believed kindness could bloom even in low places." The words twisted through him like a knife. She turned then, and her gaze, unseeing, brushed across him. "If love must exist," she murmured to her maid, "I would rather be loved by a servant than pitied by a duke." Alaric's breath caught. For the first time since donning his disguise, he felt the full consequence of his deception, not as a nobleman, but as a man who had betrayed the only heart that had ever spoken truth to him. The rain fell harder, blurring her figure until she seemed a vision fading into mist. In that moment, he knew the charade had ended. Whatever the cost, he would reveal himself, for silence had become the cruelest disguise of all. The morning sun spilled softly through the tall windows of the manor, painting the marble floors gold. Theodore, dressed once more in his plain servant's garb, stood near the staircase, polishing the banister with mechanical motions. Each stroke of the cloth was a distraction from the ache behind his ribs. For 3 weeks, he had walked among his own staff unseen, listening, watching, questioning everything he once thought certain. Yet the doubt in him had only deepened, no longer directed solely at her, but at himself. Lady Eleanor had been raised to perfection, poised, graceful, the embodiment of noble expectation. But beneath her composure, Theodore had glimpsed something else, something that unsettled him. He had seen her moments of stillness when she believed no one watched, her hands clutching a letter too tightly, her eyes shining with tears that she quickly brushed away. He'd heard her voice soften when speaking to the gardeners, her laughter genuine when helping the kitchen maids decorate a simple cake. None of that matched the rumors he had heard, nor the aloof woman his mother had described. The contradiction haunted him. That morning, he followed her discreetly to the greenhouse. She often came there before breakfast, always alone. Through the fogged glass, Theodore saw her kneel among the rose bushes, pruning carefully, her hair pinned up in an effortless coil. The air shimmered with the scent of earth and dew. He stepped inside, heart thundering with both guilt and longing. She didn't notice him at first, humming quietly as sunlight poured through the glass, wrapping her in gold. "My lady," he said softly. Eleanor turned, startled. For a moment she blinked, recognizing him as the quiet servant who had replaced the butler's assistant weeks ago. "Oh, it's you," she said with a small smile. "You move like a shadow. You'll give me a fright one day." "I'm sorry, my lady." He bowed his head, his voice barely steady. "You shouldn't work so hard yourself. The gardeners could handle these." "I prefer to do it," she replied, clipping a wilted rose. "When I tend to them myself, they bloom better. Perhaps because I talk to them." She looked at him then, eyes calm, honest. "Do you think that foolish?" He met her gaze for the first time. "No, my lady. I think it's kind." Something gentle passed between them. She smiled faintly, then said, "Kindness is often mistaken for weakness in this house. My father believes emotion clouds judgment. My mother, well, she calls it my greatest flaw." Her voice trembled ever so slightly, betraying years of restraint. Theodore wanted to speak, to tell her he knew, that he too was bound by expectation, but he remained silent. He was still the servant, not the duke. His identity hung like a secret blade between them. Over the next days, he found himself drawn to her again and again, inventing reasons to linger near the halls where she walked, to carry trays past the rooms she entered. He began noticing small things, the way she tucked loose hair behind her ear when nervous, how her laughter brightened the dull corridors, how she paused before answering someone harshly, always choosing gentleness instead. And then came the night of the masquerade ball. It was held in honor of their engagement, though she didn't yet know the Duke himself would attend, at least, not as the man she expected. Theodore had arranged everything under the guise of being part of the staff. He watched her from across the ballroom, hidden behind a silver mask. She was radiant in a gown of deep crimson, her eyes alive with a light he hadn't seen before. When the orchestra began to play, suitors and noblemen circled her, bowing low, eager to claim her hand for a dance. She smiled politely, her grace faultless, but her gaze often drifted toward the window, distant and yearning. When the clock struck 9, she excused herself, disappearing into the gardens. Theodore followed, heart pounding. The night air was cool, the moon high and pale. He found her sitting on a stone bench beneath the willow trees, her mask removed, tears glinting in her eyes. "Forgive me," she whispered, not noticing his presence yet. "I wish I could love him the way everyone expects. But how can I love a man who has never once looked at me as a person?" Theodore froze. Every word cut deep. She continued softly, speaking to the stars. "The Duke, he writes perfect letters. He speaks with charm. But I don't know who he is. I don't even know if he sees me, or only what I represent, a name, a dowry, a union of power. Sometimes, I wish he would appear before me as a stranger, without title, without expectation. Then maybe, I could truly know him." Tears blurred Theodore's vision. He had disguised himself to test her heart, only to hear it laid bare against him. He stepped forward slowly, unable to stay hidden any longer. She gasped when she saw him, this servant who had always lingered at the edges, now standing close enough for the moonlight to reveal the storm in his eyes. "My lady," he said quietly, voice breaking, "if you could meet the Duke as a man, not as a title, what would you say to him?" Eleanor's breath caught. "I would tell him I am not perfect," she whispered. "That I tire of playing the part everyone demands. That I long for honesty more than luxury. That I could love him, truly, if only he dared to be real." The silence that followed was heavy, charged. Theodore's mask slipped slightly. She saw a flicker of something in his face, something too noble, too familiar. Confusion crossed her eyes, but before she could speak, footsteps echoed from the terrace. Theodore turned sharply, retreating into the shadows as the other guests entered the garden. Eleanor stood alone again, composing herself. But her gaze lingered on the darkness where he'd stood, heart racing, unsure why that servant's voice had sounded so heartbreakingly familiar. Inside, Theodore hid in the servants' corridor, leaning against the cold stone wall. Her words replayed endlessly in his mind. She didn't love the Duke, not the image of him. But she might love the man beneath, if only he had been honest. The masquerade music swelled faintly through the walls. He pressed his hand to his chest, whispering to the empty hall, "Then I'll give her the truth." Outside, the wind rustled through the rose garden, carrying away the last notes of the waltz. And though no one saw him slip away from the manor that night, by morning, the Duke of Ravensshire would no longer be a ghost in his own home, but a man determined to reveal his heart, even if it meant breaking it first.